Hi you guys, welcome back to my channel. I appreciate you coming back. If you don't already know, my name is Madeleine Klein and I talk about Canadian true crime and missing persons. Today I want to talk about a case that was extremely high profile back when it happened in 1995, but has somehow been forgotten about. And this really surprises me because of how gruesome and downright bizarre this case is. Today I want to tell you about 14-year-old Sandy Charles from La Ronge, Saskatchewan, who killed a 7-year-old boy after being inspired by the movie Warlock. Sandy and his 7-year-old accomplice, William Martin, believed that if you drank the boiled fat of an unbaptized virgin male child, you would gain the ability to fly, just like in the movie. Before I get into the details of this case, let me put a strong warning on this one. Viewer discretion is highly advised. Not only are the murdered and murderers children, but the heinous details of this case may be disturbing to some viewers. So why don't I start right from the beginning? Sandy Charles was born on July 6, 1981 in La Ronge, Saskatchewan. La Ronge is a town in northern Saskatchewan with a population of just under 3,000 Cree and Métis people. It was like 2,600 in 2016, so I'm just kind of guessing now. Sandy's mother was only 17 when she had him, and by the time he was born, she had split up from his father. Sandy's father remained in contact with Sandy and was actually quite present in his life up until his untimely death in 1984 when Sandy was only 3. Sandy's father was hit and killed by a drunk driver, and although Sandy was only a toddler, he seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, and this trauma caused him unimaginable sadness. It was after the death of his father at 3 years old that Sandy would hear voices for the first time. Sandy was eventually given 2 siblings who he loved and often cared for when their mother was working. The children were often left alone for long hours so their mother Jean could provide. She worked at local bars and restaurants trying to make ends meet. Sandy's home life was described as neglectful and chaotic, with his mother having 4 different live-in boyfriends over the period of 11 years. In Sandy's adolescence, he was shy but responsible. He worked a paper route from a young age, quitting only 8 months before he would commit murder, and like I said, he would often care for his younger siblings. He was normal in the sense that he liked watching TV and playing Nintendo, favoring genres like sci-fi and fantasy, one of his favorite games being Zelda. Outside of technology, Sandy enjoyed playing baseball and basketball. Academically, he does well in the 8th grade, applying himself and willingly participating. It's said that he was a pleasant kid. One teacher would say he was very quiet, but had a wild and intense imagination, bordering on bizarre. Sandy's mother noticed a change in her 13-year-old son, but chalked it up to growing pains or normal teenage depression or angst. Sandy becomes withdrawn and angry. The voices come back a decade after hearing them for the first time. Sandy's mother would find him on more than one occasion sitting in the dark staring at his feet. When she asked him what he was doing, he said he was thinking. Unfortunately, Jean had no idea that Sandy was thinking about suicide, homicide, and occult. He believes there's always something beside him looking at him. Sandy's mom wonders if perhaps he's the victim of sexual abuse, a crime that happens all too often in all corners of the globe. She asks him and he denies, but he refuses to speak further on the topic and never brings it up again. Sandy was largely interested in ghosts and spirits and often talked about his paranormal experiences. This is not all that strange because Sandy's mother, too, firmly believed in spirits, ghosts, and magic. It sounded to me like she was very involved with and connected to her Indigenous culture. She would tell Sandy about her dreams, often violent in nature, and believed some of them to be premonitions. Shy and socially awkward, Sandy had trouble making friends his own age. Sandy befriends William Martin, a little boy 7 years his junior, and cuts everybody else off. When Sandy is introduced to the 1991 movie Warlock, he becomes enamored with the film, watching it repeatedly. Super quick synopsis about Warlock. Basically, it's about a warlock, from 1691 who's captured by a witch hunter. Before the people can execute him, he is saved by Satan and plopped into present-day Los Angeles. Well, present day then in 1991. In Los Angeles, he's looking for a witch's Bible to become the Antichrist, but in order to do so, he needs to gain the power of flight. The only way to do that was to drink the fat of an unbaptized virgin male child. The warlock kills a little boy, boils his fat in a can, and drinks it in order to fly. While Sandy becomes obsessed with this film, he also becomes obsessed with murder and Satanism. His main goal is to please Satan and be able to fly. After befriending 7-year-old William Martin, the two watch Warlock several times together and are constantly discussing the plot. They agree they should perform the ritual portrayed in the movie to gain flight and please the devil. They would spend a week selecting their victim and planning the slaughter. The boys decided on 7-year-old Johnathan Thimpson, who also happened to be William's cousin. The boys assumed Johnathan was not baptized as he had no father present in his life. This was the main factor in selecting their sacrifice. On July 8th, 1995, Sandy informs William that today is the day they will kill Johnathan, and William is excited and readily agrees. Sandy takes from his mother's kitchen a paring knife and an empty soup can and hides these items in the bush behind his house. In the afternoon, Sandy invited the victim to play baseball with him and William. It's said that Sandy usually picked on and excluded poor Johnathan, so of course the child's going to be excited and readily accept the invitation to come play. When Johnathan arrives, the plan is executed. By script, William tells Sandy, "We don't have a ball, you lost it." Sandy tells Johnathan if he finds the ball, he'll give him $10. The three boys disperse to look for the imaginary ball. They were about 25 feet into the bush behind Sandy's house, close to the hidden weapon, when Sandy beckons Johnathan over, telling him his hands smell like skunk. When Sandy puts his arms out toward Johnathan in a way to let him smell them, he reaches over, covers Jonathan's mouth, and attempts to break his neck. Johnathan struggles with Sandy and manages to bite him on the middle finger. When this doesn't work, Sandy retrieves the paring knife from its hiding spot and stabs Johnathan in the head 4 times. The 5th blow would be to the jugular vein, ultimately being the cause of death. But death was not immediate. Johnathan would slowly bleed out, shocking Sandy at how much blood there actually was. William Martin stood there, encouraging Sandy, cheering him on, yelling things like, "You deserve it, Johnathan." The voices in Sandy's head were also urging him to honor Satan and kill the boy. Sandy believed Satan was coming to Earth in the year 2000 and believed the killing would put him in Satan's, quote, good books. He wanted to be a disciple of Satan. Sandy would deliver a 6th and final stab into Johnathan using so much force that the knife broke off, embedding the blade in Jonathan's eye. Johnathan is still living. Discarding the now useless knife in the grass, William hands Sandy a beer bottle, which he uses to strike the already bleeding and struggling child. The bottle shatters and cuts Sandy's hand. Sandy's young accomplice William finds an 11-pound rock and suggests Sandy deliver the final blow with it. Struggling to lift the makeshift weapon, Sandy succeeds and drops it on the still struggling Johnathan. This impact still does not kill him, and Sandy finishes the job by covering his nose and mouth until Johnathan finally succumbed and stopped breathing. Drenched in blood, Sandy tells William to go and get him a towel. William obeys, running to Sandy's house. Sandy cleans his hands and face with the towel and then removes his blood-soaked shirt. William hides the bloody linens under his own shirt, and the two make their way back to Sandy's house. Sandy would spend an hour cleaning himself up and washing his clothes. It was 7-year-old William Martin who reminds Sandy they still need to collect the boy's fat for their potion. Sandy takes another knife from his mother's kitchen, as well as a pair of tongs. The boys return to the scene, and Sandy cuts 10 to 15 strips of skin and lard off Jonathan's lifeless body, placing it in the soup can with the tongs. Upon returning to Sandy's house again, the teen puts tinfoil on top of the can and puts it on the stove to boil and render the fat. Once this process is complete, Sandy pours the liquefied fat into a second soup can and discards of the first, which now only contains solidified human remains. Sandy hides the can of liquid fat under the stairs in the basement. Sandy returns to the kitchen and cleans up after himself, putting the utensils he used back into their rightful spots. During this time, Jonathan's mother believed him to be in the care of his grandmother and vice versa. Jonathan's grandmother thought he was with his mother. This went on all of Saturday, July 8th and most of Sunday. It wasn't until the two women ran into each other in town that evening and realized neither of them had Johnathan. Concern was immediate when they realized neither had seen him since the previous day and immediately filed a missing persons report with the RCMP. RCMP did not immediately begin a ground search. Volunteers issued posters of Johnathan and went door to door looking for any piece of information. Sandy and William were part of that volunteer group. When RCMP try and trace Johnathan's last known whereabouts by interviewing neighbors, they learn the last people he was seen with were Sandy and William. On Monday morning, July 10th, a day and a half after the murder, it's William who instructs Sandy to move the body as it's too out in the open. Sandy dragged Johnathan through the bush and put him in a small covert closer to his neighbor's house than his own. Due to many reported sightings of Johnathan, a ground search was delayed even more, thoroughly investigating these sightings. In the afternoon of July 10th, Sandy is questioned as to whether he had seen Johnathan that Saturday. He said he did. He told the officer Johnathan was playing baseball with the boys when he became upset and stormed off, and that he hadn't seen him since. By Tuesday, the citizens of L'Orange are growing impatient. Where is Johnathan Thimpson? A woman by the name of Michelle Harding, who was the Métis Nation elected director of Saskatchewan, could not stand by any longer and watch the police dawdle. Just after noon that day, Michelle orchestrated her own search party. Just after 5 p.m. that same evening, police questioned Sandy again. This time Sandy gave them more information about the baseball game and even took the police officers to where the game took place. Sandy showed the officer their makeshift baseball field with large rocks marking all of the bases. The officer noted base 1 was missing. Sandy is calm, cool, and collected throughout this whole ordeal. Leaving the officer with no further suspicions, he leaves Sandy's house. At 7 p.m. that night, only 6 hours after Ms. Harding put the search party together, residents and volunteers locate what is left of Johnathan's already decomposing body. He is just 3 lots away from where Sandy had shown the officer where the youngsters were playing baseball. 300 feet from his grandmother's house and 450 feet from Sandy's, which is only 135 feet from where he was last seen. When I tell you this shook the community of L'Orange, that would be a terrible understatement. The details of the grotesque nature in which Johnathan was found in was too much for many citizens, and they were unable to read about or talk about the case. Many parents feared for their children and no longer permitted them to play outside. After Johnathan is found and foul play is obvious, Sandy and William are brought down to the police station for separate questioning. Both boys would deny that they were at all involved in the horrific slaying, but in the end, it was Sandy who confessed. William, the younger of the children, kept tight-lipped, while Sandy, turning 14 only a week before, described in vivid and disturbing detail what happened to police. Police also quickly noticed the cuts on Sandy's hand and examined the bite mark on his finger, matching it exactly with Johnathan's dental records. Johnathan's autopsy revealed that the official cause of death was loss of blood due to a skull fracture and the gash of the jugular vein. On July 13, 1995, Sandy Charles is arrested in his home in L'Orange, Saskatchewan, and charged with murder in the first degree. When police search the house, they recover all items used during the crime, including Sandy's bloody clothes and towel, the knife and tongs, as well as the soup can with the human remains still in it. In November of 1995, it is determined that 14-year-old Sandy Charles will stand trial as an adult. Meanwhile, children under the age of 12 are not considered criminally responsible in Canada. Therefore, now 8-year-old William Martin will not stand trial. William is taken by social services under protective care. Because of William's age, he was shielded from the media and slipped into the shadows of life. His whereabouts today remains unknown to the public. But the internet is a really great place, so if you're watching this and you're like, hey, I know what happened to him, please let me know, because I'm very nosy. The trial would start June 18, 1996, after nearly a year of being held at a youth detention center. Sandy's fate rested in the hands of a judge, not a jury. One man was responsible for determining whether Sandy was guilty or not guilty by reason of insanity. Sandy pleads not guilty due to mental incapacity. The argument between the prosecution and the defense is not whether Sandy committed the crime, but whether he was of a sound mind when he did so. Did he realize what he was doing and the impact of the consequences to follow? It doesn't take a professional to know Sandy is mentally ill, but did he lose touch with reality while committing these atrocities? 4 doctors, all of whom are psychiatric experts, testified on the stand. 2 for the prosecution and 2 for the defense. The defense states that Sandy indeed lost touch with reality while killing Johnathan and experienced an acute psychiatric episode. It wasn't until Sandy saw how much blood there was that it kind of registered to him that this wasn't fantasy. In their findings of interviewing Sandy, they believed he suffered from a delusional disorder. He had a low IQ of 78, borderlining on mentally impaired, as well as personality problems. The doctors would say they believe Sandy is very dangerous. The doctor also suggests Sandy could have been highly influenced by William Martin, who played a huge role in the murder. We know he planned with Sandy and encouraged Sandy to carry out the plot in full. Sandy would tell the court when he took the stand that it was indeed William who wanted to go through with the entire ritual. It was William most interested in the fat of the child and actually smiled while Sandy was collecting it. It was William who directed Sandy to move the body the next day to avoid detection. The courtroom is once again horrified when Sandy tells them William wanted to eat Jonathan's heart. Sandy says William asked him if he retrieved the heart, telling him that if you ate it, you would gain special powers. 7-year-old William played a huge part in the murder of his cousin, even helping select him as a victim. He helped Sandy lure him away and supplied Sandy with the beer bottle and 11-pound rock that aided in the murder of Johnathan. Sandy would tell the court that he had moments of hesitation while carrying out the murder, but continued when he saw William smiling. During the trial, it is suggested that, although extremely rare, the 2 boys could have experienced a mental disorder known as folie à deux. The condition is explained that the dominant person will be suffering from the most severe form of the illness, and the other person may adopt delusions. So who was the dominant mastermind of the entire plot? Sandy would say he cried for 2 hours after the murder, whereas William didn't seem upset in the least. It was then, Sandy would say, he knew there was something wrong with William. Yeah, that was the first clue there was something wrong with him. William doesn't seem affected by the murder, either during the act or after. But remember, William is too young to stand trial, so we don't get to hear from him or his side at all. The prosecutor asked a psychiatric expert if Sandy would have committed the murder if there were a police officer nearby. The doctor responds, probably not. The prosecutor uses this answer as a point that Sandy knew exactly what he was doing. The prosecution argued that Sandy inquired with an RCMP officer about how long he would spend in jail if he had planned the whole thing from the start. He also told the officer that he hadn't planned to or wanted to use the paring knife, which is why he tried to snap Jonathan's neck first. Wasn't this enough to prove Sandy knew exactly what he was doing? My eyelid is sticking to my face. This was textbook premeditation, planning for over a week. 3 psychiatrists believe Sandy was showing signs of schizophrenia, but the utter lack of guilt and remorse over Jonathan's death was bothersome and alarming. One psychiatrist said that he had seen thousands of psychotic people, but none with a psychosis as serious as Sandy's. He tells the court that under this kind of delusion, the person experiencing it usually believes they're defending themselves or helping somebody else. Sandy did not display aligning emotional reasoning. He points out that Sandy made a plan, chose, and lured his victim, goes through with the crime, remembering it in great detail, as well as returning to the scene multiple times. It's said Sandy even spoke with Jonathan's mother shortly after killing her son and talked about a movie rental. Okay, I don't think I'm ever going to be able to do this all in one breath, so I gotta read it. Okay. The doctor would go on to say, quote, "It defies psychiatric sense he was in some sort of state that miraculously cleared up as soon as the killing was over." The prosecutor said Sandy was fully aware and willing to take orders from William. Sandy knew killing Johnathan was wrong, morally and legally, before, during, and after the murder. This doctor also confirms Sandy is extremely dangerous. While detained in the youth center, Sandy seems to relish in his notoriety. He loves that people know who he is and what he's done. He talks constantly about being convicted and sent to a penitentiary, fearing he'll be sexually assaulted. He hopes to be found insane and sent to a hospital. For whatever reason, Sandy thinks he'll only spend 2 years in a mental facility and then be freed. He brags about this to detention workers and others being detained. During the trial, Sandy looked obviously bored in the prisoner's box. He would slump his shoulders, yawn obnoxiously. He would groan loudly and make noises, interrupting those being questioned. His behavior escalated when the prosecution suggested he isn't crazy. He would drag his long fingernails across the wood of the box and kick the panels at his feet. His lawyer had to ask him to be quiet after muttering obscenities, and even flipped off the prosecution when a recess was called. I mentioned before that 3 of the expert witnesses believed Sandy to be schizophrenic. The 4th believed he was afflicted with grandiose delusions, which is a sign of psychopathy. The 4 experts are split down the middle on whether Sandy is criminally responsible. On August 2nd, 1996, the judge reaches his verdict. The judge appreciates the fact that Sandy planned and covered up this murder, but concludes that he was, over this period of time, suffering from delusions or an acute psychotic episode. Sandy Charles was found not guilty by reason of insanity. Although it's a verdict that upsets many, Sandy did not get what he had planned. He is sentenced indefinitely to a mental facility due to his declining mental state since the arrest. A 5-member review board of 2 psychiatrists, 2 lay people, which are just like regular citizens, and a judge are given 45 days to put together a recommendation on where Sandy should go. While this decision is being made, Sandy is sent to the Saskatchewan Hospital in North Battleford until he is deemed no longer a threat. Sandy is evaluated by doctors and a report is prepared for the review. This report is due to be reviewed every 6 months to deem how safe Sandy is and how treatable he is. At one point, the board decides to send Sandy to a treatment center in Oakville, Ontario that specializes in teens. Side note, if you watched my video about Peter Woodcock, Canada's youngest serial killer, I'll link it below, he was also sent to an institution in Oakville, Ontario. I wonder if it's like the same one or if they're connected or something. Anyway, Sandy would spend only a brief period in Ontario because it would cost Saskatchewan taxpayers $500 a day for him to be housed at that treatment center. Sandy's stay would cost $38,000 before returning to the Saskatchewan Hospital in North Battleford. Sandy continues to get reviewed every 6 months. Being on antipsychotic drugs and a little bit older, Sandy seems more alert and interested in these reviews. However, he is still reluctant to participate in interviews or activities. At 16, he learns at a 6th grade level, but does well. He tells the judge he wishes he could see his mother more, who has visited him only once. This, of course, snowballs, leaving Sandy feeling deeply sad and unbelievably hopeless. Although he is not experiencing the episodes and delusions he was 2 years prior that got him sent there. On March 30th, 1998, Sandy Charles manages to escape the Saskatchewan Hospital in North Battleford while out on a walk on the grounds with an unarmed therapist. Sandy mentions to his therapist he's tired and then bends over as if to tie his shoe. Sandy's therapist lets his guard down and takes his attention off Sandy to look at what I'm assuming the surrounding view. It is then Sandy takes off running and is soon out of sight into a thick of trees. Knowing how dangerous Sandy is, the therapist did not try and chase him and instead radioed for help. Sandy was assessed that very morning and permitted to go out on a walk, which he had done many times. This was the first time he attempted escape, and he was successful. The RCMP immediately issues an alert stating Sandy is psychotic and dangerous, and a manhunt ensues. Police hope he wasn't picked up by a hitchhiker or has made his way into the city. My dad was actually at the Saskatoon Psych Center when Sandy escaped from North Battleford, and he said it was crazy. He was working there. I have no idea what he was doing because he's a carpenter. Probably maintenance or renos of some sort. Anyway, I inquired about his experience. He didn't say much, except for that when Sandy escaped, it was like a huge deal, and that the North Battleford Hospital looks like it is straight out of a horror movie. So that's nice. At 6 a.m. the following morning, after 15 hours of ground and air searches, as well as following up on possible sightings, RCMP receive a call about a man wandering in a field just 2 kilometers away from the hospital. It is Sandy Charles. He is immediately arrested and returned. Sandy would not be allowed out in the yard again. 8 months later, in November of 1998, it was suggested Sandy be allowed back out on the condition he wore a satellite tracking device. This request was not granted. Sandy was considered too much of a risk after his escape earlier in the year, and was actually sent to the Maximum Security Regional Psychiatric Center in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. This is where the worst of the worst are sent. It doesn't help that there are rumors and suspicion of abuse and inhumane treatment from unqualified staff. Assaults on staff at this facility double any other facility in the province. In 2000, when Sandy was 18, he faced an assault charge for kicking a nurse in the head and knocking her unconscious. He pled guilty and received 24 hours in solitary confinement. In May of 2013, a review board of mental professionals deemed Sandy no longer at risk and want to send him back to the Saskatchewan Hospital in North Battleford. They want to begin the process of possibly reintegrating Sandy into society. Unfortunately, the opposite happened. Sandy did not make any progress and was surely not ready to be reintegrated into society. He starts behaving badly, resulting in being restrained many times. He was returned to the Saskatoon Psych Center 4 months later on September 17, 2013. Just over a year later, in 2014, Sandy tells the board he would like to try and be transferred back to North Battleford within the year. He says he's been working on his anger and behavior and making a solid effort to socialize with others. He wishes to be rehabilitated and introduced back into society. This request is denied. And that brings us to present day. Sandy Charles still remains at the Saskatoon Psych Center. He has no set release date. I mentioned this before, and I'll link the case below, but just like in the case of Peter Woodcock, Sandy Charles was found not guilty by reason of insanity as a teen. Both killers will spend more time incarcerated or detained than they would have had they been found guilty of regular first-degree murder. Sandy is now 41 years old and has spent 65% of his life institutionalized with no set end date. I'm really surprised at how little this case is talked about. I remember my dad telling me about this case probably around the time he escaped. So I was probably like 5 or 6, maybe 7, maybe a little bit too young, but whatever. I have always thought about this case and just how bizarre it is. Why isn't this case more well known? I could only find one book about it. I will link it below. It's called Kids Who Kill Sandy Charles by Catherine McMaster. It was like $6 on Amazon and a fantastic read. As always, I gave you a super summarized version of events and especially the trial. But if you are interested in knowing more about this case, please read this book. It goes into great detail of the trial as well as Sandy's mother and what she was thinking and feeling during all of this. It talks about how this tragedy affected the community of L'Orange. I can't say enough good things about this book. Very informative. So that is the horrible, grotesque, devastating story of Sandy Charles. Let me know what you think about this case in the comments. Is Sandy insane? Was it all an act? I don't know. There's obviously something mentally wrong. But I feel like Sandy also displays a lot of characteristics of a psychopath. I just can't believe that a case of this caliber could happen so close to me. I'm like 4 hours away from L'Orange. I've never actually been. I've been to La Loche, which is even farther up north. Anyway, maybe that's why this case has always stuck with me, is because it's so close to home. Who knows? I am rambling and I better wrap things up here. My throat's getting sore. I want to thank you guys so much again for being here. I super appreciate it if you've made it this far. I can't wait to hear from you, and I will catch you guys later. Toodles!